Hey there YouTube, it's Nick with Feeding Fitness. I recently mentioned in one of my All You Can Eat Wednesday videos that I was taking a caffeine break, and some of you showed some interest in that, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about what that is, why I do it, how often I do it, etc. So for those of you who don't know, I'm a caffeine fanatic. I drink a lot of coffee, I like energy drinks, I have caffeine in my pre-workout. Now, there are a lot of benefits, especially to someone who's fitness-minded, to want to take caffeine. There's proven research that caffeine aids with weightlifting, that it does provide energy. We all know it provides energy, as well as some other benefits. And there's really not a lot of concrete evidence showing that caffeine has a lot of detrimental effects. Now that being said, caffeine is still a drug. It's arguably an addictive drug, as there is a withdrawal from discontinuing caffeine. And like most drugs, you continuously have to up the dose to achieve the desired effect. The first time you have caffeine, it's going to hit you hard, it's going to work great, and as time goes on, you'll have to have a little bit more caffeine to get that initial feeling. If you were like never a coffee drinker, and then the first time you had coffee, you got a good coffee buzz, and then next thing you know, you're drinking espresso shots, and then you're having red eyes, which is coffee with espresso shots, and so on and so forth. That's because you need to up the dose to get the effect. Why do you think the big cup at Starbucks is ginormous? There's a reason for that. People who seriously love their coffee need a lot of it to get that desired effect. Now, do you reach a point where you're just consuming dangerous levels of caffeine? Well, that's hard to do. The human threshold for caffeine is very, very high, and most people don't have any worry hitting or achieving that. Anybody who harms themselves with caffeine usually did so because they were using powdered bulk caffeine in an unsafe manner. If you have powdered bulk caffeine, which I put in my pre-workout, and you just put a scoop of it in a cup, that's extremely dangerous, because a milligram of caffeine is equivalent to a milligram of caffeine powder. It is pure caffeine. So if you put in like a tablespoon, you might be getting in 15 grams of caffeine, which is an insane amount. Now, is that enough to kill you? I don't know, but it certainly is not good for you. That's way more than you should take at a single time. So how much caffeine is too much caffeine? Again, this is going to be largely personal. Certain people are very sensitive to stimulants. They just need a little bit of a stimulant and they get a big effect from it. Those people don't have too much trouble with caffeine because they don't end up taking a lot of it because they don't have to. They drink one energy drink and they're good for 4 hours, 5 hours. They have one cup of coffee that holds them, through the day. If that's you, that's fine. You probably don't need to consider caffeine breaks. I'm fairly I wouldn't say I'm stimulant resistant, but I'm definitely tolerant of some serious stimulants. I can take caffeine on caffeine on caffeine and be okay. So for me, when I get into the consumption of around 1 gram to 1.5 grams of caffeine throughout the course of a day, not all at once, of course, that's when I've decided that's a little much for me. It gets to the point where it's hard to get any effect from the caffeine because I simply require so much. So at the peak, when I'm consuming the most caffeine, I think it was recently, I was probably drinking 1 energy drink a day. So we'll round that and say that's like 200 milligrams. It might be a little more, a little less. We'll round it. I was taking 400 milligrams with my pre-workout, so we're already at 6. And then on nights I would work 2 to 3 strong, large cups of coffee. They could have been around 200 milligrams each. Now there is data about how much caffeine is in a cup of coffee, but so many things are dependent. But that being said, I was probably taking in to 1 gram to 1.5 grams of caffeine on certain days. And that, to me, is too much, because at that point I'm either taking caffeine all the time or I'm not getting an effect out of it. So how do we lower this tolerance? Well, it's really easy. You take a break from caffeine. Now, there are lots of different studies that argue the amount of time it takes to reverse your tolerance, how fast your tolerance builds back up, and the evidence isn't totally concrete. So I'm just going to tell you what I do. It's always seemed to work for me. It seems like a reasonable approach. First thing you're going to want to go 12 to 14 days with as little caffeine as possible. I won't say no caffeine because sometimes that's hard to do. Caffeine is in a lot of things you don't really remember that it's in. It's in chocolate. It's in even a lot of drinks, sodas that you might not think have it. Certain root beers have caffeine. I think cream soda has caffeine. You really have to be careful to avoid caffeine completely. But I would say keep it as low as possible, if not zero. So discontinue caffeine 12 to 14 days. Now you can approach this one of two ways. Some of you, like me, can just stop having caffeine. There are withdrawal symptoms associated with abrupt discontinuation of caffeine. I fortunately experience them very, very mildly. I do not get headaches. I do not get shakes. I don't have so much of a mental craving, like a psychological addiction. I don't experience really any of those. The only thing that was hard for me, I work night shift, and I was a lot less awake at the wee hours of the night into the early morning when I would usually be pumping the coffee. That's really when I thought, oh, I really want coffee. You know, if there was any mental addiction, that's when it occurred. But after the first few days, that was over. Now, some people experience all the things I mentioned. They get pounding headaches, migraines, they get shakes, they get restlessness, or they're just tired all the time. Now, if this is you, you don't want to discontinue caffeine abruptly. You want to wean down your dose. If you're having about 1,000 milligrams a day, cut it to 750 for a few days, then cut it to 500 for a few days, so on and so forth, until you're at zero, then start your 12 to 14 days. Fortunately for me, I can do this quick and dirty. Stop abruptly, wait my 2 weeks, and then get back. So that's how I do it. Now, you also, this is very important too, when you start reintroducing caffeine after your break is over, don't go right back to having 1 gram to 1.5 grams in a day, or this whole process is going to need repeated very soon. I drastically reduced my caffeine intake after this break was over. I'm only needing to take about 200 milligrams with my pre-workout, and I'm trying to have caffeine only 1 more time in a day. I'm trying not to have coffee on a day that I have an energy drink. It's a one or the other choice for me now. I'm trying to drink tea more often, which has sometimes no caffeine, depending on what kind of tea you have, but if you have a green tea, it has a really insignificant amount of caffeine, and then black tea is closer to a cup of weak coffee. But in comparison, it's going to be hard to get to that level of caffeine drinking tea. So that's where I'm going for now. Now I'm sure as time will go on, I'll need to up the dose. But if you do that slowly, you can make it so that you only need to have these breaks a few times a year, maybe 3 or 4 times a year. But if you dive right back into it head first, and next thing you know, you're drinking 1 gram to 1.5 grams, or taking in 1 gram to 1.5 grams of caffeine, you're going to be right back to having this break, and you don't want to have to do this all the time. It's just kind of annoying. So, but that's really how most of you could go about reducing your overall caffeine intake and lowering your tolerance. Now, like I said, you can build this tolerance up very quickly if you let it. If you're just upping the dose and upping the dose every single day that goes by, you're going to be right back to where you started, and in that case, it's probably not worth it to begin with. So, one other thing I will mention, caffeine disrupts your sleep. Even if you're the person who can drink coffee and then go right to bed, that caffeine disrupts the quality of your sleep. You shouldn't drink caffeine, I would say, 6 to 8 hours before you plan on sleeping. And I know some of you think, oh, you don't need to do that, I fall asleep fine, but you just really shouldn't. And sleep is so important to your recovery, and sleep is a big part of all of you achieving your fitness goals, whether you know it or not. You just recover better when you get adequate amounts and good quality of sleep. And caffeine can affect both those things, either making it hard for you to get to sleep, affecting the quantity, or disrupting the quality of your sleep. And both of those things are really, really important. So that's another thing that I try to do. You know, when I work night shift, my last cup of coffee, I try to make it around 1 a.m. and I usually get to bed around 8 a.m. in the morning. So that caffeine is fairly out of my system. So that's a good way to approach that. You don't want to be drinking caffeine very close to bedtime for various reasons. So that's all I have to say in this video. If you have questions about caffeine intake, drop them down below. You can put comments over at Facebook at facebook.com/feedingfitness. Click the thumbs up button, give the video a like if you enjoyed it, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and I will see you guys next time.